It's time for the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, June 26, 2020, and my name is Pam. Let's begin with our first article. Will Focus on Racial Justice Give Black Candidates a Boost? By Harry Brunis. At the end of May, when hundreds of thousands of Americans around the country started marching in protest over the death of George Floyd, many observed that this time the protests felt different. Not only was there a greater urgency, punctuated at times by violence, looting, and aggressive responses from local police, but the Black Lives Matter banner now included hosts of white Americans in numbers not seen previously. Since then, a number of young Black congressional candidates have seen their campaigns surge. Once considered long shots as they mounted primary challenges to Democratic incumbents or other establishment-backed candidates, Black progressives running in New York, Kentucky, and Virginia appear to have the wind at their back as voters head to polling places Tuesday in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. In New York's 16th District, former Bronx Middle School principal Jamal Bowman has found himself in the spotlight in his bid to oust Republican Eliot Engel, a 16-term incumbent and one of the most powerful Democrats in the House. First-time candidate Mondaire Jones is battling a crowded field of candidates for an open seat in New York's 17th District. Like Mr. Bowman, he is backed by leaders of the left or progressive wing in Congress, including Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, and Republican Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. In Kentucky's Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate, Charles Booker, a progressive candidate and the youngest Black legislator in the Kentucky House of Representatives, was found by one recent poll to be running ahead of Amy McGrath, the former Marine fighter pilot favored by most Democratic officials to take on Senator Mitch McConnell, arguably the most powerful legislator in all of Congress. We're on probably week 3 or 4 of daily protests in most major cities around the country. Protests that are multiracial, multi-generational, and across the ideological and party spectrum, says Theodore R. Johnson, senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. There's no doubt that the focus on Black Lives Matters and the sense that there need to be more representation by Black Americans in our system of government has helped create the tailwinds behind some of these candidates. Indeed, a number of polls, voters have begun to single out racial justice issues as among the most pressing problems facing the nation, even ahead of the coronavirus crisis, and comparable to the economy, jobs, and cost of living. It's now becoming an issue that has gotten to the top of the agenda, says Gail Alberta, professor of politics and public administration at Fairfield University in Connecticut. It now surpassed healthcare. It's surpassed other things like foreign affairs. Now we're looking at conversations surrounding criminal justice, policing, and other sorts of issues concerning racial relations. Already a trend. In some ways, the surge by Black progressives this election cycle was already part of a wider trend, experts say. Since 2018, a number of Black women have taken the executive reins of major American cities, including London Breed in San Francisco, Lori Lightfoot in Chicago, and LaToya Cantrell in New Orleans. Even high-profile Black candidates who were not successful in 2018, such as Democratic gubernatorial nominee Stacey Abrams in Georgia and Andrew Gillum in Florida, likely helped pave the way for some of the candidates who followed. I do think those candidates provided a roadmap for newer Black politicians seeking office and answered some questions about the kinds of coalitions they could build, says Mr. Johnson. How do you get Black voters who actually tend to be more moderate and white voters in Democratic primaries who tend to be more liberal, all on the same team behind the same candidate? I think what Black progressives are able to do is make the ideological policy appeals to white liberals while also making the sort of descriptive representation that appeals to Black voters, he said. Generational shifts. In taking on Mr. Engel, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Bowman hopes to follow the playbook of fellow New Yorker Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, the self-described Democrat socialist who pulled off a surprise 2018 primary victory against former Representative Joe Crowley, a powerful kingmaker in Queens and a ranking member in the House's Democratic leadership team. Representative Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts is another progressive woman of color who defeated a 10-term Democratic incumbent in 2018. There is really a strong bench of young people coming up, and in many cases they are challenging those who are seen as insiders, moderates, or part of the existing leadership, says Jean Zaino, a professor of political science at Iona University in New Rochelle, New York. The question, however, is whether white voters will indeed embrace candidates such as Mr. Bowman, who has also accepted the socialist label. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez won in a district in which half the residents are Hispanic, 18% are white, and 11% are black. The district now represented by Mr. Engel includes some suburbs in Westchester County. A third of its residents are white, a third are black, and a quarter are Hispanic. In Virginia, 36-year-old physician and black progressive Cameron Webb has made headway in a 4-candidate race to become the Democratic nominee in the state's 5th congressional district, which includes Charlottesville. Though Republican-leaning overall, the district ousted incumbent Republican Representative Denver Riggleman in a drive-through convention earlier this month. A conservative Trump supporter, Mr. Riggleman appeared to lose party support after he officiated at a same-sex wedding. The open seat could now be more competitive in November. Charlottesville is a good area for Cameron Webb, says Mr. Johnson. Not only is it well educated and with a very prestigious university there, which tends to signal a populace that leans on the liberal side, but also given the events of Charlottesville from a couple of years ago and the ongoing Confederate statue debates the state's having. Even though the area doesn't have a large black population, I think white liberals here are certainly more open to supporting a black candidate. Still, all of these races on Tuesday have local idiosyncrasies. Dr. Zaino notes the adage that all politics are local. A lot of the so-called establishment candidates have also themselves done a good deal for progressive causes, she said. Nobody can accuse Eliot Engel of not being a friend of the teachers, for instance, even though Bowman's obviously had such a long history with education. But Engel is part of the leadership. He's been in Washington for 30 years. He's older, Dr. Zaino continues. I think we're seeing just a huge amount of support going to younger progressives, and this is really being buttressed by this money that's coming in from the left. Particularly when you're talking about primaries where turnout is usually smaller. The people who do turn out really care about those endorsements from Sanders, Warren, and Ocasio-Cortez. Politics with respect. At the same time, white liberals continue to be energized by racial justice issues, Mr. Johnson says. The question is, how much of these new tailwinds are substantial and will endure, he says. People are looking like they want to do something, and supporting black politicians is a good way to exercise their Black Lives Matter protests in a more traditional sense. This next article is titled, Voicing Solidarity Against U.S. Racism. Arabs Expose Scourge at Home by Taylor Luck. In Amman, Jordan, Abu Yahya watches protests in Minneapolis rage on his mobile and shakes his head in amazement. Here they say, we aren't racists, that we are all Arabs and Muslims until they see my skin, says the Sudanese refugee in Amman, Jordan. Then they call me slave. Just as there's an awakening in America, it's time for our society to wake up. The protests following the policing killing of George Floyd that are shifting perceptions in the United States have also sparked a growing awareness that even here, in a region that has experienced invasion, colonism, oppression, and war, there is a need to come to terms with its own past of colorism and racism. Yet the growing debate in the Arab world about attitudes towards race was kicked off not by police brutality or historically tainted statues, but by ham-fisted and tone-deaf attempts to express solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. In recent weeks, several Arab stars, singers, and actors sparked by a backlash by posting online statements that inherently reinforced racial stereotypes. One Algerian singer posted a photo of herself in complete blackface, the word solidarity written across, and the sentence, "Just because we are black on the outside doesn't mean we are black on the inside." A Lebanese actress posted a digitally altered photo of herself in blackface with an afro saying, "I wish I was black," while other media stars denounced the violence against Black Americans while voicing casual colorism and racism, such as, "It's not their fault. That is the way God made them." People don't overdo this solidarity, Miriam Abu Khalid, a Black Palestinian actress, says in a viral video seen by over 2 million, because that itself is racism. History. Analysts say part of the Arab world's struggle to acknowledge racial inequality, racism, and a culture of colorism stems from a refusal to acknowledge a muddled history with Black population. The George Floyd protest have opened an opportunity for us, but we still live in societies that are in denial about our very existence, says Kala Kiski, a Black Tunisian activist who leads a collective demanding the right of Black Tunisians, an estimated 10 to 15% of the country's population. With the Arab world acting as a link between Africa, Asia, and Europe, there is a range of skin colors among the Arabs: white, olive, tan, brown, and black, sometimes within the same tribe. But there has long been a bias for whiter fair-skinned actors, models, and potential brides and grooms, and an inherent prejudice against Black Arabs with origins in Africa, a colorism activists say is rooted in slavery. From the 9th to 19th centuries, Arab merchants and rulers played a role in the trans-Saharan slave trade and the Indian Ocean slave trade, with merchants selling Black Africans either on to the West or to be used as laborers and servants in the Persian Gulf and in Arab cities. In addition to employing indentured servants and slaves, the Arab world absorbed a migration of African workers, merchants, and traders from modern-day Zanzibar, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. Black Arabs from Sudan also settled permanent communities in the Arab world in Iran. Ottoman, French, and British colonial powers barred these communities from receiving services and filling positions of power. By the 20th century, post-independent Arab nationalist leaders eager to depict the utopia of a united nation papered over marginalized and impoverished Black communities, deleting them from their country's past and present. Activists today point to chronic inequality in access to education, employment, and housing, and cycles of poverty stretching centuries. Worse still is representation in government. Most Arab countries have yet to appoint a Black government minister. Dictators erase us and made us invisible, preventing us from even speaking or appearing in public, says Ms. Kiski. To this day, we do not know how many Black Tunisians exist in Tunisia. Until we accept and embrace Black communities, we are a long way from working towards equality. Media lens. The debate over race has opened what Arab citizens and activists are calling a long overdue discussion of Black people's representation, or lack thereof, in Arab media. The use of blackface on Arab television and in film has sparked a backlash on Arab social media, with citizens calling out the hypocrisy of actors and filmmakers, declaring solidarity for Black Lives Matter in America while wearing blackface at home. People are starting to become conscious that blackface is a problem that goes beyond cultural appropriation or exoticizing. It is a message that we look down upon Black people and that we perceive Black as ugly. Joseph Fahim, an Arab film critic and writer. In the past few days, he says, there has been a growing awareness that no, this is not right. People have been reposting clips of Egyptian and Gulf television comedians decked out in blackface, mocking Sudanese and Africans by acting lazy, dumb, rowdy, and even primitive, some scenes as recent as 2019. Meanwhile, activists in Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and elsewhere point to the lack of black media presenters, anchors, television hosts, and interviewees on the airways. The problem is not just misrepresentation in television and film, it is a complete lack of representation. Africans and blacks are not present on screen, says Mr. Fayem. In most cases, they simply don't exist. Words count. The Black Lives Matter movement has also spurred an online debate over the use of the Arabic equivalent of the N-word in daily conversation and even in newspapers, as well as the casual use of abed or slave. The firestorm has spread to the desert menu. Even as American companies reevaluate racially insensitive brand names, a culture war has erupted in the Arab world over Ras Al Abed, a round chocolate-covered marshmallow sweet popular in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and among Palestinians whose name translates as slave's head. Activists online have been posting photos of Ras Al Abed packages with a smiling character in cartoon blackface, with blinding white teeth and eyes, and wearing African garbs stating, "How is this not racist as well?" Already in Jordan, one chocolate company dropped the name of the controversial sweet, posting, "We heard you," on social media in response to the campaigners. But some Arabs have pushed back online and in the broadsheets against the charges of racism. Such words are used in jest, they say, not part of a systemic racism or an ideology of racial superiority. I wanted to answer people who say, "Miriam, you can't compare racism in America to racism in the Arab world. At least we don't kill," says Ms. Abul Khaled, the black Palestinian actress, in another viral video. In a lighthearted tone, she describes hearing mothers telling their children, "Quit playing in the sun or else you'll burn and become like Miriam," and swimming in the pool, while other patrons openly debate whether her skin color will run off in the water. Do you know that the things you say as a joke can break the spirit of a person in front of you and shatter their self-esteem? Miss Abu Caleb said. Shifts in attitude. But a change in discussion and a shift in attitudes is slowly taking shape. Tunisian malls and clothing lines have dropped Arab models and stars that recently used blackface, and pressure campaigns continue in Egypt to do the same. After 13 years of campaigning against institutional equality, African Iraqis, a minority of 500,000, are finally receiving media attention to their cause by drawing parallels between the killing of Mr. Floyd and the 2013 assassination of their community leader, Jalal Diab, in his hometown of Basra. Tunisians have held multiple protests in solidarity with Black Lives Matter to draw attention to racism in Tunisia, pressuring the government to enforce a 2018 anti-racial discrimination law, the first of its kind in the region. This is an opportunity to put the campaign against racism in the spotlight and have that uncomfortable conversation Arab societies have been avoiding for decades, says Mrs. Kiski, the Tunisian activist. "We can still teach the new generation a different way," Ms. Abu Khaled said in a video. "We can explain that people are different with all honesty. Children's hearts are pure, so let's teach them what's right from a young age." A different kind of care package. Concert goers blanket the homeless. And that's the title of our next article by Stephen Humphreys. When Ken Newman plays a concert, his merch table looks quite different from that of other musicians. Whether he's playing solo acoustic gigs or amp cranked to the max shows with his trio, Berkeley Bronx, the San Francisco-based frontman sets out the same unusual set of goods. His display consists of bags stuffed with emergency blankets, socks, gloves, nutrition bars, antiseptic creams, and contraceptives. The bundles are free, but they're not intended for the audience members to keep for themselves. When Mr. Newman isn't singing tonsil-bearing songs by Led Zeppelin, Bruce Springsteen, and Radiohead, "I have a wide range," said the vocalist. He uses his voice to enlist concert goers to assist his unique charity, Blankets for Homeless. The part-time musician asks his audience to take his care packages and distribute them to San Francisco's transient population. It's an ingenious distribution system. Since 2017, his informal street teams of volunteers have given out over 5,000 bundles. They're vital supplies delivered with a human touch. It's not just, here's a Cliff Bar, this will give you something to eat, says Mr. Newman during a recent video call. You have no idea the impact that you can have just by saying hello, just by acknowledging the person's presence on the street. Mr. Newman came to his endeavor through evolution. His first spark of awareness came during an earlier career as a freelance photographer. A newspaper assigned him to photograph children at a child care center for homeless people in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood. Here are these kids acting just like kids and having a really good time and running around and squealing, says Mr. Newman. And I'm thinking, oh, they don't have homes. Fast forward to several years ago when Mr. Newman recalls walking down Chenery Street after playing an exhilarating gig at a bar with the quartet he was in at the time. The tip jar split 5 ways amounted to $10 each. It wasn't like Mr. Newman needed the money. By then, he had launched Magnet Productions, a successful live trade show presentations company. Why not donate all gratuities from future shows instead? Here's the thing. When I made the decision to do that, I started to see homelessness around me more, says Mr. Newman, who started playing regular benefit shows for the nonprofit Compass Family Services. I just woke up to it. Eager to do more, Mr. Newman was inspired by the story of a friend who had started distributing blankets to homeless people in Boston. Mr. Newman spent $500 on blankets. Then he talked to a songwriter who had once lived on the streets, and she recommended that he bundle in other essentials too. Blankets, the Homeless was born. The power of connection. What Mr. Newman didn't anticipate was the effect of asking his street teams, the fans who typically helped by handing out flyers and putting up posters, to interact with people on the street they might otherwise not talk to. He recalls a show at the Lost Church Theater in which one attendee had a snarky attitude about the packages but took a few with him. 20 minutes later, while Mr. Newman was packing up his guitar, the audience member returned. He was soaking wet. The man told him that when he handed a package to a homeless person, he stared at the package in disbelief and kept repeating over and over again, "Is this for me?" The homeless man began crying. The concert goer told Mr. Newman, "The next thing, we're standing on the street, hugging in the rain." Mr. Newman's voice catches as he recounts the anecdote. He wipes his eyes. His story gets to me because of the look on his face. He looked at me like something fundamental had shifted in him. Mr. Newman understands the difficulty for the more well-off to interact with those on the streets. There are days when he gets riled up because homeless people trash a garden at the building that his girlfriend manages. He gets disheartened when he sees someone openly using drugs. He gets angry when they yell inappropriate comments to his girlfriend on the street. So why does he persist with Blanket for the Homeless? There are people experiencing homelessness absolutely filled with grace and benevolence that you never expect, he says. Mr. Newman cites comedian Margot Cho's street performances on behalf of homeless people as inspiration. Years ago, her Be Robin fundraisers, a nod to comic Robin Williams, renowned for helping people experiencing homelessness, featured performers including Mr. Newman. Ms. Cho has been known to join him for a rendition of Wonderwall by Oasis. The sign on a guitar case open to collect donations read, "If you have, give. If you need, take." Ms. Chow says it's the opportunity of a model in which donors just shell out money to forget about the problem. With something like Blanket the Homeless or Be Robin, there's a really direct result, says Ms. Chow. I think that's a real charitable donation. Your time and effort is being spent on something that isn't too much about financial contribution. It's more of a heart contribution. Helping Hands of a nonprofit. Mr. Newman's full-hearted effort to develop Blanket the Homeless began to run into logistical issues. On the day of a show, he'd unlock his storage unit and fill as many as 100 supply bags. Enter the St. Vincent de Paul Society of San Francisco. The goals of the non-religious nonprofit established in 1860 to help the city's most vulnerable community members aligned perfectly with that of Blanket the Homeless, says Executive Director Shari Woodridge. They offered Mr. Newman a helping hand, many hands really, to put the packages together. They also added weatherproof laminated brochures to the bundle. They're a resource guide, explains Ms. Woodridge. It provides information about where shelters are, where survivors of domestic abuse can go, addresses and phone numbers for legal services, where people give out meals, and where San Francisco restrooms are. The partnership has been a mutual blessing because it has introduced the St. Vincent de Paul Society to potential new donors. Prompting his events through our website gives us an opportunity to be seen by a new group of people, says Mrs. Woodridge. Mr. Newman, the latest fundraising venture on behalf of his charity, is a vinyl compilation album titled Blanket the Homeless. Among the contributions from local artists is a plaintive piano ballad by Mr. Newman. I wrote songs called We Should Do It Again, which was just culled from stories that I heard and cardboard signs that I read by people living on the streets. When Mr. Newman looks out his window, he thinks of people who don't have the luxury of four walls. It's made him less quick to complain, more grateful for the good in his life. The benefits that I've gotten from my commitment to homelessness far, far, far outweigh the costs, says Mr. Newman. Someone called and told me, I just saw this guy wrapped up in an emergency blanket and looking at one of the blue brochures. I said, oh, that's great. That's what keeps you going. Our next article is titled, In Italy, A Case for Music to Return to Concert Halls by Colleen Berry, Associated Press. Ravenna, Italy. Conducting a joyful Mozart motet, Riccardo Muti sent a resounding message Sunday night that live classical music has returned to the Italian stage after the coronavirus lockdown. A full summer festival program is planned in his adopted home of Ravenna, even as the musical outlook remains grim in the United States, where he also conducts the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. The renowned conductor said the coronavirus had destroyed music, with shuttered venues depriving the world of spiritual food as it faced a pandemic that still threatens uncalculated economic repercussions beyond the lives lost. Even during 2 world wars, Mr. Muti noted, theaters stayed open to provide cultural relief except during the worst of the bombings. In that sense, this virus is even more devastating than bombs, Mr. Muti told the Associated Press before the inaugural concert for the Ravenna Festival's 30th anniversary season, on which he conducted the Luigi Cherubini Youth Orchestra that he founded in 2004. The festival, founded by Mr. Muti's wife, salvaged its season by scheduling its nearly 50 events in outdoor venues with limited audiences and spacing musicians at least a meter apart, challenging what Mr. Muti noted was the literal symphonic order of playing together. In the message of solidarity that I send to the entire cultural world, I give a signal from Ravenna that at a certain point you can restart, you must restart, with caution and with care, said Mr. Muti, who has been at the helm of some of the world's most famous theaters, including Milan's La Scala and London's Philharmonica Orchestra. In the U.S., he won accolades leading the Philadelphia Orchestra in the 1980s and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra since 2010. You pay a high price for the absence of culture, he says. The Ravenna Festival program, which runs through July, is another signal of the gradual reawakening of European classic music after strict closures to slow the spread of the coronavirus. In a sign of its symbolic importance, Italy's Senate President and Culture Minister attended, along with the head of the UNESCO World Heritage Center. in recognition of the small city of Ravenna's outsized role in world history as a three-time ancient capital with 8 protected monuments and the final resting place of poet Dante Alighieri. In other signs of cultural life, Mr. Muti conducted Cimarosa, Mozart, and Schubert earlier this month with the Vienna Philharmonic, with a full orchestra at a normal distance thanks to regular virus testing, while theaters in Florence and Venice have staged concerts with small audiences. Milan's La Scala will signal its reemergence with a few musical evenings in July ahead of its official reopening in September. After leading the Chicago Symphony Orchestra on a European tour in January, Mr. Muti spent Italy's lockdown in Ravenna, studying for what is supposed to be the CSO's September season opening of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. But the start of the season remains in question as U.S. cultural landmarks like Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center in New York and Philadelphia's Kimmel Theater have announced their closure through the end of the year due to the virus threat. It is too easy to say close, but there are thousands of people who no longer provide culture and spiritual food to the public and who at a certain point won't have even a salary to live on, Mr. Muti said. Mr. Muti suggested that concerts could be held in Chicago's Memorial Park with 2,000 guests instead of the 30,000 capacity, and by first testing musicians for the virus and possibly sticking to a repertoire that limits the number of musicians on stage. During part of the CSO season that was canceled, Mr. Muti was to have conducted in April a symphony by African-American composer Florence Price, which the program says gives powerful voice to the African-American experience. Mr. Muti, who has been watching the Black Lives Matter's protest from afar, said classical music must do more to integrate people of color. In Chicago, he works with the orchestra's African American network to bring the local Black community to concerts and rehearsals, which has grown to 3,000 members since 2016. But he also recalls a 1991 concert he conducted in Philadelphia in honor of Martin Luther King, where for the first and only time I saw the Academy of Music filled 90% with African Americans. My dream would be to have many more African Americans in orchestras, choruses, and in audiences, Mr. Muti said. But this was also our own fault by giving the sensation that our musical culture is a culture of an elite, a culture of superior people, of very refined people. It's not true. We must open our arms as we have done and will continue to do in Chicago. Well, that's the end of the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, June 26th. This is Pam saying please stay in, stay safe, be blessed, and make it a great day.